Sorry, I was offline. Recording has started. Welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall, February 16th edition. And today we're looking at various forms derived from verbs in sentence correction. This is the consequence of a few questions that people have submitted about this topic in various forms. So some of you in the last week or two, some of you over a longer period of time. But if you've been waiting for this topic, then here it is. So the usual things first, we do have to start out with the warnings as usual. So the warnings and rules, especially because people have been less good than usual about this lately. So let's talk about it. Please don't do the following, ladies and gentlemen. Do not submit problems that are too general. Do not submit problems that are too specific. And then please do not submit personal issues, study plan, and so on. The big thing that people are doing this week, apparently it seems to be the trend, is this: submitting personal issues to the study hall. Again, please don't do this. Please submit these to the general folder. Because remember, the study hall is watched by hundreds of people. In fact, by the time the recording has been posted for a while, the recording has been watched by thousands. Oh, is there no audio? That's interesting. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, I think that was a network bug. Okay, what people have been doing lately, a lot of, is submitting personal issues to the study hall. Again, please, guys, do not do this. We had 4 or 5 of these in the last couple of weeks. Let me just show you a couple of what I'm talking about. So again, the general idea here is there's been a lot of violations of this section of the code lately. Please do not submit personal study plan questions or scores, etc. So here are a couple of things that people have submitted in the last week or two. Here's one question that someone submitted. Here's another one. We can't use these things in the study hall. I know we say this every day in the rules, but people are still doing this. So make sure that you don't. Okay, there is a place for these on our website. That's in the forum. Please post these things in the forum, which is at manhattangmat.com/forums in the general questions folder. Okay, smiley face if this makes sense, because quite a few of you, I don't know if you are in attendance at the moment, but quite a few of you have been submitting these kinds of things, and we can't use these because we don't want 600 people to be watching study plan advice given to one individual. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. But on the forum, we will totally address the issues that you bring to us. Okay, other things. We've seen these before, but let's look at them again. Please check the archives before you post a topic. We have had people submitting topics that have already been covered, so please don't. Please check the archives first. If a topic has already been covered, then please watch that video. If you're looking at another angle on a topic, or if there's some aspect of a topic that we haven't really covered, then please tell us what that aspect is. Like, specifically, what about that topic have we not yet done that you would like to see? So, there you go. That's the rules. Smiley face if that makes sense. Then we'll move into some problems. Smiley face icon if you guys... It's like pressing the accept button on software. Okay, so again, today's topic is this, some different forms of verbal derived nouns and other verbal forms. I did, to be perfectly honest with you guys, I did have to look up these names myself because I'm not real big on grammatical names. But gerunds are ing nouns. Infinitives are to verb. And then verbal nouns are like when you have dedicated nouns from a verb. So like destroy produces the verb. The verb destroy produces the noun destruction, and so on. A lot of verbs have these kinds of verbal nouns, others don't. For example, the verb swim, there's no noun that's like swimmage, so you don't have that. But when the verbal nouns do exist, they play a special role that is near and dear to all our hearts. Also, please use the answer buttons. The answer buttons will appear in your screen right now, so you should see those. When we put problems on the board, this is how you should answer them. You should use the answer buttons, please. So, also, it's extremely important that you click your answer exactly one time. If you click multiple times, then what will happen is the second time you click, it will erase the first click. So please don't do that. One click, and that's it. One click purchasing. Okay, let's take a look at the following problem. So here's a stopwatch. And again, please use the answer buttons, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, still a lot of people with no answer. So remember, this is the GMAT. You can't not pick an answer. So please pick something. Okay. There's a Peter Cho, there's a Prabhakar, and then there's someone who is calling him or herself Thursdays with Ron, interestingly enough. Okay, Peter, Prabhakar, if you please guess something. So to the gentleman, or I don't know if Junaid is a lady or a gentleman, in the text box who's asking about the topic of the session, the topic of the session today is this: different forms of verbal derived constructions. Okay, let's talk about this problem. Here are your statistics. Again, if you are not answering the problem, then you're not really preparing yourself for the GMAT. But let's talk about it. So 13 states from all regions of the country announced a plan to, basically the meaning of the sentence is they're going to try to control pollution with new limits on emissions. So what I want to focus on today is the difference between this kind of thing and this kind of thing. Like, what's the difference between the joint adoption and with just adopting? What's the difference between the adoption and adopting? So grammatically, both of them are nouns. So they both function as nouns. Like the first one is actually a noun, and the second is a gerund. Someone is saying in the text box that that's a participle. That's actually incorrect. A participle is what you call INGs when they are modifiers, not when they act as nouns. So, I mean, if it makes you feel any better, I don't really know these names either, and I have to look them up. But when an ing acts as a noun like this, then we call it a gerund. So here are two. What I'm going to do is make up two sample sentences and put them on the board, and then I'm going to see if you guys can take a shot at explaining the difference. So see whether you can try to explain the difference in meaning here. Two sentences. The first one is this. I have dedicated my career to the exposure of injustice in the court system. The second sentence is I have dedicated my career to exposing injustice in the court system. Does anybody want to take a shot at the difference here? It's not an easy thing to address if your first language is not English. If your first language is English, then it may be a little, you might be able to just use your ear on these sentences. But grammatically, they are both fine. The first thing, let's get out of the way, in case there's going to be a torrent of responses to this effect. There's nothing wrong with the grammar of either of these sentences. So, okay, Prabhakar is typing. J number 2, that's actually pretty bad. Prabhakar, like I just said, it's not an issue of right and wrong. They're both correct. So the grammar of each is fine. Okay, let me go back to what J number 2 said, because J number 2 is getting the point here. The difference is this. When you use a verbal noun like the exposure, this is the deal. Okay, verbal nouns like the exposure as opposed to exposing are impersonal. What this means is that they don't convey the idea that the subject is directly involved. On the other hand, gerunds generally do have that idea. They do convey the idea that the subject is directly involved in the process. So that's the difference between these two sentences. It's a difference of meaning. I have dedicated my career to exposing injustice means that I am actually the one who is exposing injustice. Like I'm actually doing it. So this means I am the one who has actually been exposing the injustices. The difference with the first one, I have dedicated my career to the exposure of injustice, means that I'm still dedicating my career to this idea in some way, but that I'm not necessarily the person doing the exposing. For instance, this sentence would still be correct if I gave a bunch of money to other organizations that exposed injustice. So, I mean, I'm somehow involved with the exposure of injustice, but not necessarily directly. So for instance, maybe I donate money from another career to a charity that does this. So that's the difference. When we say to exposing this or by exposing this, that means that I am personally involved in these things, and I'm the one doing them if I'm the subject of the sentence. So in the sentence above, the 13 states are the 13 states are actually going to adopt emission limits. So they are directly involved in this process. In this sentence, the 13 states are actually the entities that are going to adopt emissions restrictions. So you don't want by the joint adoption of, because it doesn't really convey that idea. So instead you want to actually say by adopting, because the states themselves are going to do that. So this is a better way to write that. Any questions about that difference? Okay. What I want to do is kind of treat the other things going on with a little bit more of a cursory treatment so that we can focus a little bit more, so that we can concentrate a little bit more on this idea of these verbal forms. Nobody picked A, actually, so I think we will defer the explanation of A. This is a GMAT prep problem, so if you want to ask about A, go ahead and ask about A on the forum. D, a couple of you picked. There's two problems with D. The first problem is and. The first is this word and here. This doesn't make sense. Like if you write imposing new controls and adopting emission limits, then the implication is that those are two different things that are independent. That's generally the way it works when you have X and Y. So like as another example, if I say there was a lot of traffic on the freeway today, and I was late to work. Does anybody know what the implication is here about why was I late to work? I was not late because of traffic. Exactly. And it's a couple of you are getting this incorrect. Read the explanation up here. If you use and between two things, you're saying these are separate and independent of each other. So this means that I was not late to work because of the traffic on the freeway, because the word and implies that these are two separate things. So and implies that these are separate and independent. So the implication here is that I was not made late by the traffic. Instead, the meaning of this sentence is just, here are two bad things that happened today. The meaning is just, here are two unfortunate things that happened today. If the traffic made me late, I would need to have a different connector that would actually make that point. So for instance, there was a lot of traffic, so I was late to work. And I was thus late to work. So same problem here. The implication in D is that these are different things. Like the implication is that adopting of emissions limits is independent of imposing controls. That doesn't make sense. So that's one problem with D. The other problem with D is this idiom of a plan for doing something. So you can say that but not in this kind of way. Like the difference between plan to verb versus plan for and verb ing. So plan to verb means that this verb is the actual thing that I am going to do. So this verb is some action that I directly plan to do. So for example, if I say, I plan to make money, or my plan is to make money, this means that I am directly planning to, this is what I'm going to do. On the other hand, if you say, so I plan to, let's change to something more concrete. I plan to sell my old clothes. My plan is to sell my old clothes. On the other hand, a plan for something, you can use that, but it doesn't mean the same kind of thing. What this means is that verb ing is the goal or purpose of the plan, but it's not the actual mechanics of the plan. So for instance, if you say something like, my plan for making money is to sell my old clothes. So this works. My plan for making money, so that is not the direct action, and I don't just go make money. This is the ultimate purpose of the plan, but it's not the actual step of the plan. And then in contrast, kind of like what we had over there, this is what I'm actually going to do. So the problem is that imposing new controls is not, they don't have to plan with that as an ultimate goal. Like they're planning to actually do this. So in this sentence, imposing new controls, the imposition of new controls is what the states directly plan to do. So you should use plan to. Okay. Finally, there's this. Let's get this out of the text box. All right, let's talk about it. Does anybody have a response to that? How would you respond to this question? Text box. Hey, now we're getting there. We need to understand the meaning of the sentence first. Yeah, I mean, remember that you can't use grammatical structures at random. You know, like if things are actually supposed to be parallel, according to the intended meaning of the sentence, then they should be parallel. But if not, then they shouldn't be parallel. So, like, you only want to use X and Y, as we said on the previous slide, as we said a few minutes ago. is used for two separate independent things or actions. So that's not the case here. So the parallel structure is wrong, even if it's grammatically sound. So, I mean, you can't just take random words and put them in parallel. It's very, very important that you understand this. So I noticed the original person asking the question got logged out real quick, so I hope you got to see this discussion. For more on this idea, you should see the May 13th, 2010 Study Hall edition on parallelism, when we definitely get into this in detail. Okay, let's talk about the next one. Here is a stopwatch. Go. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you are Dilip, or if you are the person calling yourself Thursdays with Ron, please pick an answer. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Here's a summary of your class statistics on this problem. So let's take a look again at the difference between the construction and constructing. Because it's the same kind of difference, but this time we want to go the other way with it. So by constructing and by the construction of. Let's take a look. So again, the difference when you have a split like this is, let's recap. Let me just bring in some notes from another slide. So here are the notes that we put on the other slide, including that wonderful comment from J number 2. So the deal is when you have the exposure of something, that's impersonal, and it's the general concept of that. Whereas exposing is the process in which the subject of the sentence is directly involved. So, well, there's a theme, Ashwin, there's a theme of today's unit that I want to stick to. I mean, you can begin with anything you want to begin with. So, in today's unit, I want to stick with the theme of today's unit. Okay, so if you look at this difference between the construction and constructing, we don't talk about who actually constructed the canals. So in this sentence, the impersonal one should be used. So the impersonal one, the option, which is the construction of, is better because we are talking about the process from a detached standpoint. In other words, there's no mention of a subject who is directly involved. So versus if you say something like the Army Engineering Corps, like that's the kind of group that would actually do something like this, redirected the rivers by constructing canals, then this would be correct. Because now you're actually talking about the entity that performed this action. So that's the way you want to write that. But here, you're just talking about, in general, the construction of these canals is what made this happen. So, again, the point being that you can't just memorize the way that these splits turn out. You have to understand what you're doing when you write each of these kinds of constructions. So, in this case, we want the construction because there's no mention of the entity performing the construction. So, these are gone. If you have any questions about that particular elimination, please type those in the box. Okay. So, as far as the verb tense goes, we actually don't have to use that, and I would prefer to avoid discussing verb tenses in general because verb tenses are very subtle and weird and not usually necessary to solve the problems. But because the only difference now is C versus the others, and C is not a fragment. C is not a sentence. So here's what we have. We've already eliminated A and B, so those are out of there. C is not a sentence. You have the subject, the Chicago and Calumet Rivers, which originally verb but verb. So there's no rest of that sentence. This is subject, comma, which, verb, but, verb. This is a fragment. The rest of the sentence doesn't exist. So the way you don't need to check every single sentence all the time to make sure that it's a fragment. But if you see constructions that are modifiers, like which, in some choices, but are actual verbs or clauses in other choices, then you should check for fragments and run-ons. Because the deal is that if something is a modifier, it can't also be a verb. And if something is a verb, it can't also be a modifier. So if you have these rivers, like, have been redirected, and then there's no which, versus here. So D is also a fragment, because this is a modifier, and this is also a modifier. So C is just subject which. D is subject ing modifier, but ing modifier. So again, this is not a sentence either. On the other hand, the construction of E is legitimate. We've got a subject, and then we have an ing modifier, and then we have an actual verb. So this is a sentence. So there's your verb. Have been redirected. So it turns out we don't need the other, we don't need to bother with the verb tense to solve this, because we can use the actual nature of whether this thing is a sentence or not. If you want to ask a question about the verb tense, please find a thread on the forum about this problem and use that so that we don't get too far off track in today's study hall. Find you a thread. Here is most of your questions about verb tense should be addressed on one of these two threads already. I'll put it in the chat box. Here's the first thread. Everybody should see it. Here is the second. Together, these threads are 33 posts long. So, actually, I think it's the same thread. So this thread has like 24 or 33 posts or something like that. So please post verb tense questions in that thread. I think the person who posted this question, I think this means that you were late today. So we've already had this discussion actually 2 times. So if you missed this discussion, then please watch the first 30 minutes of the recording when it shows up. Because we actually already discussed that 2 different times. So if you were late, then check that out. Questions about the stuff that we discussed in this problem, especially this. By the way, if you are the latecomer, it's basically what's posted on this screen. So if you want to just take a look at this screen really quick and try to absorb the lessons that are on it, this screen will be up for 30 or 45 more seconds if you want to check it out. So still help to watch the video, but that's the basic idea. Any questions about this, go ahead and throw in the text box, please. Otherwise, we will move on to another problem. Okay. Now, let's talk about another aspect of this. So here's what we've seen so far. And if you came late, then you'll also get most of it. I'm going to recap the main points here just to make sure we're clear on it, so you should be fine. Here's what we learned so far. When you have verbal nouns like the exposure or the construction or the adoption, those are impersonal. And what I mean by the impersonal is they refer to the overall notion of this action and its consequences, without a reference to the performer of the action. So if you have something like the adoption of strict drug laws normally just drives the drug trade underground. So this is correct. You wouldn't want to say adopting here because you're talking about this impersonally. Like this is impersonal. There's no reference to who is adopting these laws. Versus if you have adopting these laws, that could make sense only if you are actually like talking to a congressperson or something like that who is actually considering adopting the laws. So if you say something like this, adopting strict drug laws, I mean, this ordinarily wouldn't make sense, but it would if you were talking to someone who could actually do this. This would only make sense in a conversation with someone who actually had the power to adopt drug laws. So, when you have gerunds in modifiers, so, or like the gerund forms So not necessarily modifiers. Adoption, adopting rather, constructing, etc. are used when the subject is directly involved. So, for example, Congress drove the drug trade underground by adopting strict drug laws. So in this case, you would want by adopting because Congress did that. Now, there's one more thing that you should know about gerunds, and that is, this is probably not a rule that you're going to find in any book. It's something that I've just seen empirically in lots of sentences that are correct, which is that gerund forms can also be used to describe a process performed by people, even if the person or people performing the process are not mentioned. If the focus of the sentence is on the steps or execution of the process itself. So, I mean, that's a mouthful. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Like if you say, swimming is good exercise, or if you say, losing weight often but not always involves counting calories. So, I mean, this seems like it's an exception to what we wrote up here because this is impersonal. And so you would think that you would write like the losing of weight and the counting of calories. But when you have processes that are performed by people and the emphasis of the sentence is actually on that process, then that's the point. So if you, Nemi, I'll use that in a couple of examples. But I mean, the point is not the end result of this or this as a general concept. Like the focus is on the process. So not on the general idea of these things. So, Mo, the answer to your question is already in this sentence because counting is not a subject here. Counting is the object of involves. So this is a general idea. So the deal is that, like, you wouldn't use adopting up here in this way because you're not the focus is not the process of adopting the laws. Like, this is a sentence about the net result of having done this. It's not a sentence about the process of adopting. So, let me take Nemi's question and let me compress some of the stuff on the board first. Okay. Let's get some more space here. All right, so one of today's visitors wrote this. This is not really correct because there's no emphasis on process here. So if you say, this would only work, it's kind of like the adoption of drug laws up there. This would work only if you are actually talking to someone who is considering adoption. Because then you're personalizing the sentence. So, otherwise, if you mean this in general, then what you would write is the adoption of children, or the adoption of a child is a noble act. On the other hand, if you actually had a process-oriented sentence, so if the sentence were actually about the process of adoption or adopting a child, then you could use this kind of construction. So if you say something like, adopting a child involves thorough background checks and grueling interviews. So then this would be a correct sentence because we're actually talking about the process this time. Like this is a sentence that is actually about the steps involved in adopting a child. And so that's what we're saying up here. It's a process if the focus is on the actual like execution of the process. So I mean, let me know if you, especially Nemi, but everybody, smiley face, if this makes sense. Like this sentence here about a noble act is not at all about the process of it. It's just like the general idea of adoption is cool. On the other hand, this is like, here's the steps involved in doing this. So then adopting. So complicated, but you know, languages are like that. Languages are not simple. So this is about as uncomplicated as I can make this without being inaccurate. So any questions about the stuff on the board? If not, we'll move on to another problem. Okay, here's a problem. Have fun. Okay, let's talk about this. If you are Angelo Lozano, please answer the problem. Remember, this is a test on which you have to answer all the problems in the order that you get them. Okay, let's talk about it. Here are your class statistics. So, okay. So remember what we said here on the last slide. When you have a process that people perform and the emphasis of the sentence is on the steps or execution or details of the process, then an ing form is generally the way that's used for that. And that's exactly what's happening in this sentence. The focus of this sentence is on the process of genetic engineering. So this sentence is about the steps or process of genetic engineering. So a process performed by people. As a result, the emphasis is also on the process of splicing genes. So the ing form is okay. You can also use the splicing. I mean, it doesn't give this the meaning of process-oriented anymore, but I mean, the splicing is not wrong. Although it loses this notion of being process-oriented. So, in this case, you can't really split between the splicing of and splicing. These are both okay. Like, if you view this sentence as process-oriented, then you can use this. And if you view it as a sentence about, like, oh, this general idea involves that general idea, you can write it this way. The one thing you can't do is this. I mean, it doesn't involve genes. It involves the process of splicing those things. So A and B don't convey the meaning accurately. Also, getting spliced is informal. It's not acceptable in formal language. So, and then B, this is not accurate. The process doesn't involve genes that get spliced. There's also that problem with get. It involves the actual process of splicing them. So you should write a sentence that conveys that idea accurately. So otherwise, though, the splicing and the splicing of and splicing are okay. Does anybody see a more pervasive and probably easier way to eliminate on this problem? If you do, then throw it in the text box. But yeah, you can just use parallelism with either or. So that's pervasive enough that we should discuss it, even though this unit is not really about parallelism. So use parallelism. So if you don't understand the mechanics of this, if you want more details, you can see the May 13, 2010 study hall. But the basic deal is that if you have either X or Y, then the stuff in these blanks should match. So if you have A, either to improve or for warding, nope, that's not cool. Either for improving or the warding off, that's not okay. Either improve or to ward off, that's not okay. Either to improve or to ward off, this is legit. And either the improvement or to ward off is not okay. So you can actually solve this problem with parallelism alone. Okay. So there you go. If you didn't see that, you definitely should have seen it, because parallelism is the single most commonly tested thing that you're going to see on this exam. So if you don't understand how parallelism works, then be sure to watch this recording if you don't fully understand parallelism. One of the most important, if not the most important topic that you can cover. So there's that, but then there's also this notion of process-oriented ing. So kind of like adopting a child involves lots of interviews. Any questions about this one? If you have questions, throw them in the text box. Otherwise, we will do a new problem. Okay, nobody's typing. Here's a new problem. Go for it. It's a little bit longer, so I'll give you a little bit more time. Have fun. Okay. Everybody's got an answer except Angelo. Angelo, man, you got to answer these problems. Please use the answer buttons that are over there if you don't see that. Okay, we should be able to get through this one pretty quickly because most of you guys nailed the heck out of this one. But here are your responses. So let's look at parallelism first. There's a parallel structure here. There's two methods of cutting emissions. Emissions must be cut in two different ways. So if you have, here's your connector, here's your parallel structure, it's AND. The in some cases is just a modifier, so as far as parallelism goes, it doesn't really count. So let's take a look at the parallel structure. In A, it's by fossil fuels that are burned and by alternatives such as hydrogen fuel cells. This is not parallel because these items are not parallel to each other. Like the first one is fossil fuels. That's the actual fuel. If that was going to be parallel, you would need another fuel. This is not a fuel. The fuel here is hydrogen. Like if you had fossil fuels, that would be parallel to hydrogen, but not this. The other problem is that this sentence is not true. Like the meaning of this sentence is not legitimate because you can't cut emissions by fossil fuels. So also, this sentence is nonsense. Emissions must be cut by actual fossil fuels. Doesn't make sense. But you have to say emissions must be cut by some process that actually cuts emissions, not by fossil fuels. So this has the same problem with being nonsense. So also nonsense. And then the parallelism here seems not 100% wrong, but you can't say, because this would be fuels and this would be other fuels, but it doesn't make sense because emissions can't be cut by fuels. On the other hand, let's look at the parallelism in the other choices. Burning and by replacing, that's perfect. Grammatically parallel, and these are both processes that actually do what we say they do, that actually cut emissions. So that's good. By more efficiency and by alternatives, these are not parallel. Efficiency isn't parallel to alternative fuel sources. And then the same problem exists here too. First, fossil fuels is nonsense again. Also, efficient burning, which is a process, is not parallel to fossil fuels, which is not a process. It's a thing. So the parallelism is wrong in all of these choices except for C. So we can solve the problem again by just appealing to parallelism. But let's make sure that we talk about the connection to today's theme, which is the use of ing to refer to a human process. So again, the emphasis, like we don't mention who does these things. So this ing is not personalized. In other words, the person or entity who actually does this stuff is not mentioned. However, burning and replacing are processes performed by humans. And the other requirement is that the emphasis of the sentence is totally on the process and not on the general notion of these things. So what is actually involved in cutting emissions by this process or that process? But you can also just solve this one with parallelism. Most of you nailed this, so I'm assuming that we can go on. But let's take a look. Okay, nobody's typing questions. Let's move on to another one. Try that, nice and short, so I'll give you just about a minute. Go for it. Okay, please take another 10 seconds or so and answer the question. Thanks. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's see. Okay, so also very well done. Here are your class statistics. Let's take a look this time at comparing or comparisons. So how do you make that decision? There's two ways that you could do this. Tell me in the text box. What's a way to make that decision? Yeah, between the two of you guys who have commented, you got them both. The first way, and honestly probably the simplest way, is just to look at the parallel structure. So let's get that out of the way first. But then Catherine demonstrates a nice understanding of today's topic. So we'll get to that here in a sec. The first way you can do it is just use parallelism. Just notice that, ironically, you have a comparison involving comparisons. So you have blah, 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 blah can be as questionable as comparisons between humans and mice. So definitely you need to have comparisons again. You can't say comparing this can be as questionable as comparisons of that. So definitely need comparisons to be parallel. Comparing is not parallel. Comparisons is. So there's that. That's one kind of quick and easy way to do this. The other way, and the reason I wanted to present this, is for you also to understand what Catherine is saying. Which, this is not personalized. So, like, I mean, there's two situations in which you use the ing. The first is it personalized, which is what Catherine is pointing out. Like, no, there's no mention of who or what makes the comparisons. And then, is it an emphasis on process? Is it process-oriented? No, it's an abstract statement about the general idea of a comparison between these things. So you don't want to use ing. ing doesn't make sense. So not only is it not parallel, this is the simpler way to figure it out, but it's also not legit according to those guidelines that we had earlier in the study hall. The difference between D and E is a very, very, very common idiom, which you probably know. It's so adjective or adverb that. You don't say so different from these things for this to happen, because that's just not a legitimate idiom, whereas this is. So that leaves us with D, like dog. Well done, guys. Let's look for another problem. If you have any quick questions, feel free to throw them into the text box. Okay. How about this? This one's a nice one for the things that we talked about with these different forms. Give that a shot. George Washington Carver, the Peanut Man. Here's a clock. Okay. You guys are just on fire today. Sweet. Here are your class statistics. Again, doesn't seem like we need a whole lot of love for this problem here, but let's take a look. So, the first thing is the parallel structure in the latter part of the sentence. So on the right, you have a parallelism between two ways of strengthening the economy. So, and is your connector. Let's take a look at the things that it connects. So these are decently parallel. These are not. These are. These are not. And these are. But so now what are we talking about doing? Well, George Washington Carver dedicated himself to doing these things directly. So GWC worked directly to strengthen the South, but he wasn't actually a planter of soil or a crop worker. So back to what we said before, this notion of, from earlier in the study hall, remember that INGs are personalized. They convey the idea that the subject is directly involved. Whereas the verbal nouns are not. They are general ideas or notions. So notice this actually decides both of these in the direction that C is using. George Washington Carver actually worked to strengthen the South. So GWC was directly involved. He dedicated his whole life to it. So that you'd use the ing for that. On the other hand, he didn't actually work in these fields. I mean, he worked towards economic strengthening by promoting these things, but he didn't actually improve soil or diversify crops by himself. So the sentence, GWC didn't actually improve the soil, etc. So you should use verbal nouns for these. Okay, otherwise I think the whole world picked C here, so I think our time would be better spent with another problem. So let's take a look at another one. How about this? Last problem of the day. Go for it. Okay. We still have a couple of people without answers, so please pick something. All right. Okay. Give me about 10 seconds here, sorry. All right, sorry about that little delay. Okay, here are your class statistics. If you are Mo, please pick an answer. Mo. And Angelo Lozano, you should also pick an answer, although Angelo hasn't been picking anything all day. Mo. No answer from Mo here. Okay, this one looks like it's challenging us a little bit more, so that's good. Here are your responses, kind of all over the place. So, by the way, every problem in today's study hall is from the GMAT Prep software. Okay, let's talk about this. The proliferation of these people led to passing or the passage or the act itself. The first thing to get out of the way is that it's not the act, because that's inaccurate. That's not the correct meaning. So the best way to explain that kind of thing is by analogy. If the meaning of D and E is not right. Like led to the act itself doesn't really make sense. It makes it sound like the act is just kind of there and it springs up from nothing. Like for instance, here's an analogy. If you say something like sexual intercourse leads to babies, that's incorrect. But if you say something like sexual intercourse leads to the conception of babies, then this is correct. Because it's just a matter of what's literally true versus what isn't. I mean, the proliferation of cyber squatters didn't make a law from nothing. It led people to pass the law. So this is more logical. Now let's talk about passing versus the passage. Okay, this sentence is not process-oriented. So can we use passing? So, long and winding, be careful with that. In general, if English is not your first language, you should not use awkwardness as a criterion because you won't be able to judge it. In fact, even most people who are native speakers of English are very bad at judging the quality of writing. But for people who didn't grow up speaking English, it's nearly impossible. So I would avoid any use of long and winding and awkward and things like that. Because those are, I mean, there's a name for that method at the end of the day, and that name is guessing. So, okay. Can we use passing? Well, there's two instances where we can use this. The first is personalized. Well, no, it's not personalized because the person, the people, or person, it's like Satish is saying right now, the person or people who passed the law are not mentioned in the sentence. And is this process-oriented? No, it's not. This sentence is not at all about the steps or process of passing a law. So you don't want to use ing here. You want the passage because it's impersonal. It led to that notion of that general event. So that leaves us with B and C. Okay, the B and C are not that different. I'll give you some other pointers here real quick. The main point here is the use of the ing versus the use of the passage. But here are a couple of other quick points. The first is in B. If you compare B and C, compare the use of which. Okay, which is meant to refer to the act. So it should be placed next to the name of the act. So the problem is that in 1999 is in the way. Like, this is the thing that is which. You can put that in 1999 anywhere, and in fact it makes more sense next to passage anyway, because that's what happened in 1999. So neither of these modifiers in B is well placed. Like, also in 1999 describes the passage of the law, not the law itself. So this modifier is also better placed in choice C than in B. So we want C. Now, the general idea that you should take away from this is that when modifiers are moved around, like when you see the same modifier moved around to different places, don't try to memorize a bunch of rules for where you should place it. Just ask yourself a simple question. Which version places the modifier closest to the stuff that it actually describes? So that's the deal. because this is something you can't, there's no point in memorizing 100 million rules for this. Just understand that the point of modifiers is to modify stuff. And so it should be most clear when it's right next to the stuff that it modifies. So, and again, the problem with the question that Satish is asking is that this is a comparative thing. This is not an issue of B is like right or wrong. When you look at these, the question is closer or closest. You just have to look at answer choices and see which one is doing the best job of this. So trying to make a bunch of examples and hash out exact rules for this is not really a productive use of your time. I mean, remember, these are always multiple choice questions. So when you see this kind of issue, you don't need hard boundaries like that. You just need to look at B and look at C and say which one does a better job of putting the modifiers close to the right stuff. And the answer to that is definitely C and not B. The question, Junaid, there's also an idiom issue in B. An intent that they will sell is not idiomatic, although you either know that or you don't. So I don't really want to spend a ton of time talking about that. But intent that they will do this is not okay. So if you know that kind of thing, then you know that kind of thing. Also, don't forget the and. We talked about that earlier with the example with the freeway. If you didn't see that, then watch the earlier recording of the video. If you, Peter Cho, that would be fine. The answer would be yes, because then that would be just the name of the law. The and in choice D here also mistakenly suggests that these are separate. So that they're not separate, so you can't use and there. Okay, the main deal though, the way this pertains to today's unit is the passing versus the passage of. So that's the main deal that you should get here. If you have any quick questions, we can take those, but we have to be out of here in about 2 or 3 minutes. So thank you for coming, and keep submitting things, but please check the submission rules before you submit. They're on the page. They're also at the start of every one of these sessions. So, yeah. Okay. Guys, if you have questions about the, okay, for further questions about this, I'm on a very tight schedule. So what I'll have you do is just, if you have further questions on this, please find the thread on the forum that deals with this problem and post your questions there. I mean, your answers are probably already there. Here are some links. Here are 2 threads on this problem in the forum. The first one is 21 posts. And the second one is 27 posts. So the odds that your question is already answered in one of these are virtually 100%. But there's 21 posts, there's 27 posts. If you have questions about the little details of the question, then please post them in those threads on the forum. And not right this second. Okay. Anything else, admin type questions, go ahead and ask those. Otherwise, we're going to close up shop here, and thank you for coming. Prabhakar, I don't know if that's a question, but if that's a question, please find that problem in the forum and post your question in the forum. Thank you. Okay, let's kill it. I'm going to stop the recording.